Welcome to today's webinar on the Thrifty DBA does database security. My name is Phil Ryman. I'm the Director of Business Development at Integrity, and I'll be the moderator for this e-learning session. The speaker today is Steve Coast. Steve is the Chief Operating Officer and founder of Integrity Corporation. He's been working with Oracle products since 1994, and for the past 12 years, Steve has focused on the security and auditing aspects of the Oracle Business Suite, PeopleSoft, and the Oracle database, and has written and presented on these topics at various national and regional conferences, including OAUG and the National Collaborative Conferences. Steve is recognized internationally for his vast security knowledge and expertise. I'll now turn it over to Steve.
Thanks so much, Phil. Today's topic is the Thrifty DBA does security. And the impetus for this presentation was that we have a lot of clients. Integrity does a lot of on-site work with different Oracle database customers, and we really work with them to implement security in a holistic, programmatic way. This presentation was based off of a lot of conversations we've had over time with, unfortunately, the client can't afford a specific security solution. They may be looking at tools like Oracle TD, Oracle Database Vault, Imperva, Guardian. And they were looking for cost-effective ways to do that, both in time and effort and money. And so this presentation really looks at some of the options. Usually there's always two options to do something, and this presentation is typically looking at the one that, okay, what do you have today? What can we use that's existing in your environment to actually improve database security without buying third-party products and spending a significant amount of money? So before we get started, a quick overview of Integrity. Integrity was founded in 2001, and we specialize in database security and security for ERP applications like Oracle Business Suite and PeopleSoft. We have two sides to our business. We do have a set of products. First is AppSentry, which is a database security scanning tool, so it will actually validate the security of your Oracle Business Suite, Oracle Database, and PeopleSoft environments. And then if you're running Oracle Business Suite or PeopleSoft, we also have another product, AppDefend, which is an enterprise application firewall specifically designed for Oracle Business Suite and PeopleSoft. AppDefend provides very robust virtual patching, so if you're not immediately applying critical patch updates and keeping the security of your external environments up to date, AppDefend can provide an incredible layer of protection for those environments. Our other side of our business is our services business, and that's really where this presentation is from. We spend a lot of time working with clients doing large security assessments of 100, 500, 1,000 Oracle databases and working with customers trying to resolve compliance issues. So if they have SOX, PCI, HIPAA, GLBA, or they're implementing tools like Oracle Database Vault, or looking for solutions to improve security but without spending a significant amount of money, especially when you're starting to look at across a couple hundred up to 1,000 databases, trying to deploy these solutions can be very costly. So this presentation really looks at that. If you've got multiple databases, what are some of the things that you can do, potentially without buying another product, being just thrifty, using what you've already got in-house, saving time and things like that. And then finally, we also have a very active research team. So Integrity is actively looking at different products, trying to figure out how to better secure them, looking for security vulnerabilities. So a lot of the security bugs found in the Oracle Critical Patch Updates in both the eBusiness Suite, PeopleSoft, and database are actually found by Integrity. So enough about Integrity. This is an educational webinar, so we'll dive into how does the Thrifty DBA look at security. So we'll do a quick overview and then talk about a couple different topics, including auditing, how to use virtual private database, and then finish up with encryption and data masking. So let's jump into what's the concept of thrifty. So why the Thrifty DBA? Well, the Thrifty DBA is looking to make his environment secure without spending a significant amount of money or other resources, doing it carefully, not wasting money, trying to make the environment so it's very successful, so it's a thriving environment. And when we look at a thriving environment, we're looking at a secure environment, something that is not going to be open to attackers, is hopefully applying critical patch updates in terms of security fixes, but also doing the other pieces of security. Security is not just one item. It's not applying critical patch updates. It's making sure your environment is secure, that you're doing auditing, that you're masking data, that you're protecting social security numbers and other sensitive data like credit card numbers. So that's really this presentation, is walking through what can you do with some of the tools you already have in-house or potentially some open source tools to actually make your database environment, especially large-scale environments, much more secure than it is today. So the first thing we'll start off with is the different database editions and looking at what capabilities are actually built in and what's optional. And the nice thing with looking at the Oracle Enterprise Edition is there's actually a number of security options, such as real application security, virtual private database, fine-grained auditing, that are actually built into the Enterprise Edition of the database. These are free, so you have them and you can start using them. Unfortunately, if you're looking to do tools like Database Vault and Oracle TD, those are actually add-on options. So we'll look at different options throughout this presentation about how can you buy a product or can you use some of the existing components within the Oracle database. We'll make an assumption that most of the databases we're talking about do have Enterprise Edition. In our consulting, that we work with a lot of different customers, both large, small, and medium-sized. Most of them do run Enterprise Edition. Some do run Standard Edition. So I will note when these are Enterprise Edition features or standard or missing in the Standard Edition. So let's first talk about auditing. Auditing is an area where you can spend a significant amount of money, look at a lot of different products, but it's actually very effective to do a lower-end solution, especially when you've got a large number of databases. And the way I formatted this presentation is I'll first talk about some generic security requirements, things that most organizations run into, and then how can you potentially address those using some thrifty solutions. So the first key for auditing is you need to look at important database security events and access by generic accounts. So that's typically the major auditing requirement that we see most organizations have. What's happening within the database that's security critical, then who's accessing the database, especially from accounts that are generic accounts. Oracle databases are notoriously bad, and especially applications that you put on top of them, for having lots of generic accounts. So when we look at an Oracle database and talk about a generic account, just in general, you've got the system. How are you controlling those? Do you have an audit trail to know who's actually using that information? If you're like an Oracle Business Suite customer, the apps account is a classic generic account. Again, who's using that account? How often is it used? A key part about the audit trail is, are you protecting the audit trail? Is it retained? Is it protected centrally? If it's on just every single database server in the odd dollar table, or you're running out the operating system, if someone has to go back and say, okay, a year ago something happened to the database, what happened? Do you actually have that? And can the attacker actually manipulate the audit trail? So if you're not moving the audit trail into a centralized location for protection, that can potentially compromise your audit trail. Are you raising alerts for the different security incidents? Is the audit trail archived over a period of time? So what is that requirement for your organization? Some organizations are 30 days, 90 days, 120 days, up to a year. Some organizations are 7 years. Highly secure organizations want to keep that audit trail for a significant period of time for some compliance requirements in certain cases. So there are a number of commercial solutions available. These are all very good solutions. This presentation is not about knocking any solution out there, but looking at potential alternatives based on these solutions. So there are a number of very good solutions out there. Oracle Audit Vault and Imperva Guardium are some of the top 3 ones. Unfortunately, these become very expensive solutions. In terms of Oracle Audit Vault and Imperva and Guardium, you're buying additional hardware, you're buying additional appliances that need to be put out there. And the licensing matters on database or processor we'll kind of not get into, but you can definitely go out and get a quote and kind of determine how much this is for your environment. And what we're going to look at is, can I do this in a more cost-effective way or in a slightly different way than having to buy these tools? An interesting point here, though, is we actually have some environments that have a hybrid solution. They'll actually implement these commercial solutions for their most critical databases, that these provide some features that you cannot potentially replicate in using a lower-end auditing solution. As an example, Imperva and Guardian can do OS user chaining, so they can actually look at the operating system level and know when someone SUs in the operating system then connects to the database. They can actually track that. So if you have very high-end compliance requirements in certain databases, you may have to implement one of these commercial solutions. But again, if you've got 200 or 300, maybe 500 databases, that may make sense for 10 or 20, 50 databases. That's cost effective. what are you going to do for all the other ones? A lot of organizations, well, they'll implement a commercial high-end tool for a large number of databases, and they'll kind of say, oh, we ran out of money, we can't do anything for anything else, and they'll just stop, and they won't have any auditing for the rest of their databases. If you don't know what's happening in your databases, you have a potential vulnerability and exposure to say, okay, I have no idea if someone hacked into those databases because we just aren't doing any auditing, or we just turned it on and put in $1 and not have no alerts to it, no visibility into it. That happens in many organizations. So this, what we'll look at now is either a solution to do it for every database, or potentially a hybrid solution that you do implement a higher end commercial tool for a limited set of databases, and then we'll look at a solution that, yes, let's roll this out to your other 800 databases where you did something for your 200 databases, but now cost effectively we can do that without spending a significant amount of money, but you've got the protection where you need it on the high end databases, but you also have a very good level of protection for your lower end databases. So one of the things the Thrifty DBA always does is they find a starting point. They're not going to build this from scratch. They're going to see if there's a very good resource out there in terms of how should I do database auditing and logging. And fortunately, Integrity publishes on our website for free the Integrity Database Auditing and Logging Framework. This walks through, it's about an 80-page document that walks through if you're going to do database auditing, how should you do it from start to finish. We look at, okay, what should you be auditing? How should you be auditing it? Where should you be sending the audit trails? What alerts should you be doing it? How about a maturity model looking at level 1, 2, and 3 saying, okay, today we can do these things. How about tomorrow? Let's have a plan over the next 2 or 3 years to roll out a much more robust auditing within the organization to look at critical events happening, then get down to potentially the application level that we need to do. So this is available on Integrity's website. So if you just kind of either Google Integrity Database Auditing Framework, or the URL is at the bottom, and everyone will get a copy of the slides the next day or so. So if we step back and look at database auditing in general, what can the Oracle database do? And one of the issues actually comes in that is that there's a bunch of different logging and auditing solutions within the database. And some of these start with the listener. So the listener log is different than the standard database log. And then you get the alert log. Then sys auditing is slightly different than the standard auditing. So there's actually another parameter there. Then you have standard auditing. And that standard auditing can be written out to different locations. You can write it out to the database. You can write it to the operating system. And you can actually send it to SYSLOG. And then finally, we also have fine-grained auditing. One important point here is this is all pre-12c. So when you start to move into Oracle 12c, Oracle has introduced unified auditing. Unified auditing now takes a bunch of these parts of the audit trail and actually unifies it into a common solution. And I'll talk about that in a second as kind of some of the differences here. But at this point, we're going to be assuming, even if you're on 12c, that you're still using mixed mode auditing. So what's an option here? What can we start doing to take these different audit trails and have a much more robust solution by looking at all these different pieces? And our recommendation is to look at doing a logging and monitoring system and using some of the native capabilities within the database in terms of SYSLOG to actually now start moving your audit trails out of your databases into a centralized logging and monitoring solution. This now provides you a number of key benefits. One is you can very well protect the audit trail. You're removing it off the individual database servers, putting it into a centralized location, and you can now archive it, report on it, and alert on it, as well as archive it. So for forensics purposes, now you're archiving the data off. You can archive it for 12 months or whatever. There are a couple of points where the SYSLOG audit trail only works for a few parts of the auditing trail, so if you do need to look at the alert log, the listener, and the fine-grained auditing in 12c mixed mode, again, we're looking at 12c mixed mode or 10G, 11G. This will all work for the SYSLOG. Most of the logging and monitoring solutions do have file readers, database connect solutions, so they can actually go out to the database servers and the database and actually pull off files and audit trails in terms of the FGA, log, valor, etc. The key here is the key audit trail here is number 4 and number 3, the sys auditing and the standard auditing. Again, if you can set up the database, and this is very easy to do with the initialization parameters, and you can just start sending out the audit trail via SYSLOG, you've got a huge win. Now you move the audit trail off, now you have it in a centralized location. And there are a number of very good free tools to do this. do this. There's also very good commercial tools, tools like ArcSight and Envision. But if you're looking to do this and get something up and running and have a spare server, you can now install some of these open source free solutions like Splunk, Elasticsearch, or Graylog. These solutions are available. They're very robust. They are not necessarily Oracle-specific solutions, but they are logging and monitoring specific solutions. So they have all the infrastructure you need. They may not be able to give you a standardized report out of the box that looks, oh, this is just your Oracle information. But even Splunk provides some of that out of the box. So there are free additions onto Splunk and Elasticsearch that are open source, kind of more Oracle-oriented add-ons to these tools. But again, most of what you're doing is just alerting and reporting. You want to capture the audit trail. You want to know if there's too many failed logins. Those are actually pretty easy to do, alerting and reporting for these tools. And again, these are very robust tools, and a lot of organizations are running them. When we start talking about Splunk, a lot of organizations actually run Splunk already. So this is now just repurposing the existing logging and monitoring solution. And if you do this right, according to Integrity's framework, we're not sending off massive amounts of data. We're sending off very critical events that are happening. And these events may be, except for sessions, you may be only generating 50, 100, 200 events a day per database. So that's very low overhead compared for some of these tools, like if you have an existing Splunk implementation. We also recommend auditing sessions that may generate 10,000, 20,000 rows a day. But again, like a Splunk solution, that's not a huge overhead to Splunk. That won't even make it sweat. Probably what they're doing for firewalls and routers and servers, they're probably sending significantly amount more traffic. But again, there is a free Splunk solution. So if the DBA team just wants to put up on a server Splunk, they can download the Splunk free, and you have 500 megabytes per day. We run Splunk internally for a lot of our instances, and we don't even ever get close. We pound away on them all the time, and we don't get even close to 500 megabytes a day. So 500 megabytes a day can probably support 50 to 100 databases, no problem. So if you do want to start sending the audit trail on and sending it via SYSLOG, this is fairly easy to do. Oracle natively supports, since 10.2, supports sending the audit trail out through SYSLOG. This is not available in Unified Auditing, so if you are on 12c, you can still use the mixed mode, and this works very well. From a performance perspective, it works really well too. So all you do is set audit SYSLOG level, and you set it to a facility, and then you have to make sure that the audit trail is set to OS, and therefore all the audit trail will just be, instead of being written out to a $, or an OS file, it actually just gets immediately sent out via SYSLOG. So this SYSLOG would go to the server SYSLOG by default. So on any Linux or Unix box, SYSLOG is already set up and configured. And then all you have to do in the Unix Linux SYSLOG is just put at IP address of your SYSLOG system. So if you implemented Splunk free, that's already able to consume SYSLOG. You just put an IP address in there, and within a few minutes, you're actually, per database, sending off all your audit trail off to a protected, secure location that then you can easily alert and report on. So this is a very effective solution. And again, the data is really not getting written out here. The data gets sent, gets queued up and sent off, but it's actually not going to disk, so there's not a lot of performance overhead. In addition to sending the data through SYSLOG, there's actually another number of other things you can do, especially if you've got different applications. Within the audit trail, there's something called Client Identifier. So now we're going to take the SYSLOG. We're doing some standard auditing. We're capturing the information. We're sending it off via SYSLOG to our auditing solution. And again, that might be Splunk or Elasticsearch or something like that. But now it can actually get some additional benefits. So if I'm running one of these package applications, or I can do this in any custom application, there's a field within the audit trail called Client Identifier. Well, Oracle Business Suite, PeopleSoft, SAP, they actually set the end user name within Client Identifier. So if I sign into Oracle Business Suite as an application, and I sign in as Steve, even though I'm using the database account apps, all I see in the audit trail traditionally is the apps user, the apps database user, not the end user of the application. Well, these applications support Client Identifier, so I can actually now capture the Client Identifier within the audit trail in my centralized logging solution and potentially report on that. So if I can also, let's say, audit errors. So if the errors are going into the solution, I can now generate reports to say, oh, what application end users are actually getting errors and things like that. So this becomes very powerful and effective. Another thing that you can do, again, these are very free solutions. These are just things that now I can add on. I can go into change ticket tracking and actually create a little solution here. And all I have to do is write a little package, and in the red here, it's select sys.ticket. All I do is create a little function called ticket, and it just takes a inbound number, and all it does is sets create identifier, or client identifier. So therefore, then when my DBA actually goes and does some work, they run that little SQL statement before that calls my custom function. Again, ticket is a custom function here that you wrote and then put in every database. You just call that custom function, you set 1, 2, 3. Behind the scenes, it sets client identifier. Now my DBA does some work, let's say create user. In the audit trail, it then adds in client identifier. So you see the number 2 here, 1, 2, 3, 4 is my ticket number. Now I'm actually capturing within my audit trail every user creation and the ticket number. How often have you been asked as a DBA to actually go through, some auditor comes in and says, oh, when did this user get created? What's the ticket number? And unless you do a bunch of searching and stuff, this now is automating this. And the auditor loves, then in my logging and monitoring solution, across all my databases, I can then create some very simple reports to actually generate these reports to say, okay, if I've got a ticket number, that's a valid user creation. If I don't have a ticket number, it's an unauthorized user creation. So again, now I can very cost effectively add in some very powerful auditing processes, change ticket tracking processes to satisfy my audit requirements, compliance requirements. This becomes very powerful. I touched on this briefly with commercial applications. You can also do this with custom applications. Let's say I need to know for some reason the end user is connecting my application. But again, remember, when I've got my application server connecting, that's just using the generic account. In this case, Bob is signing in, but when Bob signs in, they connect as the apps user behind the scenes. But I may need to know that which end user is actually selecting from credit card tables. And then again, you can do this as a custom. You can add this easily into any custom application, or products like eBusiness Suite, PeopleSoft, SAP do this by default. So now you're actually capturing SQL statements, and in the client identifier field is the end user application name. So again, this is a high-end feature that I'm doing in a very low-cost auditing solution. So that's a very high-level overview of auditing. So basically, we looked at how to do auditing on the cheap without having to buy a commercial solution. That's very doable, just using SYSLOG and pumping it out to some of the open source free solutions like Splunk and Elasticsearch. I have a very robust auditing solution. Another key feature that we see a lot of clients not using is virtual private database. So a lot of people say, oh, we need to go by database vault. Well, database vault is, a lot of its features are based on virtual private database. So there's certain requirements that I may need to do, such as block users from accessing sensitive columns like Social Security numbers. So there is a fundamental flaw within the Oracle database in terms of permissions. It's very easy to grant out select any table. What happens if I have a very large application? So let's talk about one of the ERP applications like Oracle Business Suite, PeopleSoft, or SAP, when there's thousands and thousands of tables. How do I effectively grant that out? Because within the Oracle database, I cannot grant out by schema. I can either grant out select any table system privilege, or I can grant out 40,000 tables. Oh, by the way, every time a single table is added, now I have to go change my grant statement and re-grant it out to all the users. So what you typically see is most organizations just grant out select any table if people need wide swaths of table access, especially in really large applications, data warehouses, things like that, because there's no granularity to do that. You can use roles and make it a little bit easier to manage, but again, you're managing, it's either everything or individual tables. There's nothing in between. I can't just say, oh, grant this person, he needs access to the HR schema, this person needs it to the general ledger schema. You can't do that within the Oracle database. So typically, when you get an auditor in or you actually look at the security of a database, there's too many people traditionally would select any table. Well, that may be fine because there's not a lot of sensitive data, but you do have things like Social Security numbers, credit card numbers that you do need to protect. And so how do you do that in a cost-effective way? The really easy way is to go by Oracle Database Vault. Database Vault is a very effective tool, provides a very robust counsel works really well. So if you do need to really lock down system privileges, that's what Database Vault is really good at doing. I can do that very effectively. So I can actually get down to that schema level permissions and say, okay, this person needs just HR schema tables, etc. And we implement Database Vault a lot. So we really work with a lot of clients who bought Database Vault and how to really effectively implement it. And it can be a very effective solution. But most organizations don't need that robust of a solution. They have a few columns that they really need to look at. And as examples, Social Security numbers and credit card numbers. How do I just protect those columns? Yes, I can go by Database Vault. It's a very expensive solution, but very effective. How else could I do that if I just need to get down to a couple columns? Well, Oracle Virtual Private Database does it for you, and it's included with Enterprise Edition of the database. So you do not need to go buy. Database Vault is based off a lot of what Virtual Private Database can do, but Virtual Private Database you already have if you're running Enterprise Edition. So how can we use that? And the Thrifty DBA wants to use what he's already got, especially if he doesn't have a significant amount of requirements. In this case, the requirement is I just need to protect Social Security numbers. How do I do that? Well, Virtual Private Database implements fine-grained access controls for the database. And it can get down to either row level or column level security. So I can actually protect certain columns within the database. And what Virtual Private Database does behind the scenes is it actually modifies the where clause of the queries that are issued. So I actually go in and say, based on, let's say you have a role, and based on that role, the Virtual Private Database policy can actually determine and change the where clause to say you have certain access to certain rows or certain columns, or you don't. And so this becomes very effective and very powerful. The significant challenge with Virtual Private Database is that it's not automated. There is no counsel to do this really well. Enterprise Manager can do some of this, but it's not that easy to use. So typically what you'll do is actually end up writing PL SQL code in terms of these calls to DBMS RLS add policy to actually now add in the policy in DBMS RLS unless you change the policies, etc. So I do need to write the policy functions. I do need to actually write the code to create the policies. But usually we don't see this being used for a large number. If you told me you had to do this with 1,000 tables or something like that, I would say Database Vault would be a much better solution. But if you say I've got this database that we've got 3 columns of Social Security numbers in different tables and we really need to protect it, we need to do it quickly, we need to do it effectively, and we don't have time or money to implement Database Vault, this is an exceptionally effective solution. And so what Virtual Private Database does is, so when I enter my query, select star from HR employees, behind the scenes it actually says, oh, HR employees is covered by a policy, therefore we need to call the function described, in this case, if you look at the code above, it's HR emp _sec. And if someone enters a select statement against the HR employees table, call that function. And what that function does is it can actually do anything you want it to do. It can figure out who should be accessing it based on any context variable passed in, etc. In this case, we'll change it. Let's say this is a European organization that has a privacy requirement. So in France, only the French users can see French employees. In Germany, only the German employees can see German employees. In this case, it's just appending dynamically to the where clause where org ID equals 1 because it said, oh, this user is part of org 1, so therefore if he queries this table, he can only access org ID equals 1. So again, this becomes very powerful. Now I can actually make changes dynamically, and I can exclude rows within the database. With Virtual Private Database, now you can take it to the next level. There is another column level set of parameters that you can do. So now I actually can change it so based on something on the user, and typically we do this with roles. And so the way we'd set this up is your policy function, empsec here, would actually say if this user has a role, either return true or false. And in this case, then we add a sec relevant columns in the options. And so if they try to query the national identifier column, and it's either select star or if you do select national identifier, based on the function policy, or the policy function, it will actually either return national identifier or return nulls. So I can now actually have someone still have full access to the HR employees table, but based on a role that they've been granted or not granted, it will actually return the Social Security number or not return the Social Security number to them. So again, this becomes a very effective solution, and if you have Enterprise Edition, you have this already. So if the requirement is, I have 3 tables with Social Security numbers and I can't have every user access them, but I still want my HR manager and other people to access it, but I may have 10 HR people accessing this database and allowed to do ad hoc queries against it. I can then just give a role to HR manager, and HR manager will be able to see the data, but when anyone else does select star from HR employees, the national identifier column will be completely nulled out. Unfortunately, this does not mask data, so I can't return just the last 4 or anything. In that case, you would need a different product, but we can talk about that in a second as another possible option. But again, this becomes very powerful, and I can either do this on rows or I can do this on specific columns. You probably won't want to do this with every single column in the database because it becomes a management nightmare, but most often the requirements are pretty limited, a few columns here and there on a few tables. It's not like every single table. So that's a high-level look at virtual private database. Again, a very effective solution if I'm trying to limit either rows or columns within the database. I can buy a database vault, but again, database vault is very expensive. And it's very effective if I do have large numbers of tables, large numbers of users, and I have to just get down to a schema level. But if I have a limited set of issues and I just need to protect against that, virtual private database is included with the Enterprise Edition and is exceptionally effective and works really well, and we implement that a lot for clients. So the 4th topic here is now encryption and data masking. So when we start talking about how do I do encryption, what are the effective ways to do that within the database, and then potentially if I'm not doing encryption, how do I do some data masking or scrambling of data within the database? We'll kind of pick on Social Security numbers here quite a bit. Credit card numbers also because of PCI compliance. So I do need to encrypt credit card numbers within the database. And most often the requirement is I need to do it on disk, on the backup tape, and also when it's transmitted across the network. So usually when we start talking about encryption requirements, people pick off individual data elements, such as Social Security numbers and credit card numbers, and they want it encrypted if they lose a disk, if someone steals a disk drive. There is a story about in Chicago that some guys took a pickup truck, backed it through the wall of the data center, ran in and grabbed a bunch of hard drives, threw in the pickup truck and drove away. That was actually a theft. Or you read the media all the time and a backup tape falls off the FedEx truck and it's lost and they have to notify everyone because their data was unencrypted on the backup media. Or if it's going across the network. By default, remember, Oracle does not encrypt any data going across the network. So if you have a SQL Net packet, that data is fully in plain text traversing your network. The only thing that's ever encrypted in network traffic for Oracle databases is the password. The passwords are not sent in clear text across the network. So these are kind of the 3 things we're looking at. How do I protect against it? And encrypt these sensitive data elements both on disk and on the backup media, and then also when it's going across the network. So for the standard database encryption solutions, there's really a couple out there that most people implement. And for an Oracle database, the really big one is Oracle Transparent Data Encryption, or Oracle TDE. Oracle TDE is very effective, but again, it's an add-on solution. There is a significant cost to it, especially if you're doing this across large numbers of databases. There's also third-party tools. The one we work mostly with is Vormetric. Vormetric also includes very robust key management, and it works across multi-platform. So there's a couple different solutions, but again, these are expensive add-on solutions. If I have to do this either across a large number of databases or a few databases very quickly and I don't have the money in my budget to do it right now, what are some of my other options? And we talk about solutions here. There are a number of different solutions available, and there are different layers. So when we talk about Oracle Transparent Data Encryption, that's a disk storage solution, as well as Vormetric, all the SAN solutions, the backup encryption, if you can turn on RMAN encryption, things like that. So Oracle TDE, again, is a disk storage solution. So if I lose a disk drive, if someone hacks into my server and steals my database files, if I lose a backup tape. Oracle Transparent Data Encryption will protect you there. But once someone signs on to the database, it is fully unencrypted. There is no encryption within the database once I sign on. I see all that data. If I have access to it, it is completely unencrypted. So there are other solutions for encryption versus TDE. And TDE is not the end-all, the be-all in terms of solutions, because once I sign on the database, transparent data encryption provides zero value. So now if I'm signed on to the database, how do I actually also, what other solutions are available to provide some of the protection there? And some applications do provide native application encryption. So like Oracle E-Business Suite for credit cards has an option to actually encrypt credit cards at the application layer, and that works fine. So if you do have package applications, definitely review what the package applications are doing. So most of the major, very large, good packages, software packages, have native encryption capabilities. Some have it on many fields, some have it just on a few, like Oracle E-Business Suite does credit card numbers but does nothing for Social Security numbers. So if you're going to do application level encryption, and let's say you have a custom application, you can actually rewrite the custom application, which again is very expensive and time consuming, and put database encryption into the application using the DBMS crypto. Or at a database level, there's actually options to do views and triggers. We've seen this very effectively done for custom applications. I would try to avoid doing it for large software packages that are commercial, because you don't typically can monkey with the application well enough to make it work. But we've seen very successfully a lot of organizations put in views and triggers on sensitive data tables, that so every time you read it, it calls a decryption function that determines if you have access to it and will then display the data to you. And then when you write it out, you actually use a trigger on inserts and updates to actually encrypt the data before it's written to the database. These become very effective, especially for custom applications. So now I've actually removed, for the database level encryption, I've gotten it down to now the database account. And so now I can actually say if someone signs on the database and they don't have a specific role or something in their account that would then give them access to the decryption keys, they can't actually decrypt the data. If they query that table, it'll still be encrypted unless they go through the view and they actually are able to decrypt it. So looking at different solutions here, one way to get around and not having to buy TD is actually, if you do have custom applications, is start rewriting parts of the application. And this becomes very effectively, again, this is not the most thrifty solution in the world, but it becomes very effective if you start this when you're starting up an application. So being a Thrifty DBA, and I'm talking to my new application developers who are writing a new custom application, and they say, oh, you need to go buy TDE for this database because we have sensitive data, we need to encrypt it. Well, that's fine, but or you could, as you develop the application, every single time you read and write the data for those key routines, or add this in as a global library into the application and let the user choose, it becomes very effective. This becomes a very effective encryption solution and very cost effective. Another option is then also within a custom application is use views and triggers. So again, whenever you're reading and writing the data with just a transparent layer, so again, now the application developers don't have to do this, but you just add a set of views and triggers within the application. So every time that data is read and written, it's actually encrypted. And then you can add the layer of security on to say, okay, when I call those routines through those triggers and views, I check the security to make sure someone has access to do that. Fortunately, within the Oracle database, when I do these custom levels of encryption, Oracle provides you support for major encryption hash algorithms. So DBMS crypto is a very good solution, and it's included with all versions of the database. So now I can sit there and actually just call standard Oracle packages to encrypt and decrypt my data. So Oracle actually has two versions. DBMS crypto is the new one, which has the newest algorithms and encryption for both encryption and hashing. DBMS Authentication Toolkit is deprecated and should not be used anymore. The one issue with using DBMS crypto is there's no key management within DBMS crypto, so you actually have to write that on your own. There are certain scenarios where you may want to buy a third-party API to do some of this. Companies like Voltage and Vormetric both have what they call format-preserving encryption. So this level of encryption, let's say you've got a credit card number that's 16 digits. If I use DBMS crypto to actually encrypt that data, it becomes much larger than 16 characters, so or 16 numbers, 16 digits. A tool like Voltage API will actually take that 16-digit number and actually encrypt it into a 16-digit number, so I don't actually have to change column sizes and things. So there are a few situations where the Thrifty DBA may find it do a cost-benefit analysis and may be cheaper to buy the Voltage API that uses format-preserving encryption that's not available in the Oracle libraries, but it may be cheaper than actually having to re-engineer parts of the database to actually support it. So the Thrifty DBA is always looking at, okay, what are my options? What's the most cost-effective solution? Because paying a little bit of money may be the most cost-effective solution in certain cases. And in this presentation, I just want to lay out the options. So there's lots of different options here of what you can do. Again, the DBMS crypto comes standard with the database, and it uses and supports all the standard industry standard encryption hashing algorithms. And so the application just calls DBMS crypto to encrypt it and decrypt it, and it supports AES, it supports SHA-1, and it's very effective. But again, the key management is critical here, and you do need to write your own key management routines. So when we talk about key management, huge mistake we see all the time is, okay, I have to encrypt data using DBMS crypto. How do I do it? Oh, I write a PL SQL package, I hard code my encryption keys in that PL SQL package, and then I'm going to protect it by wrapping it. Well, unfortunately, the Oracle wrapping is broken, and there's actually, if you just search for Oracle Unwrap on Google, you'll actually see a number of websites that if you just pop in the wrapped code, it'll actually unwrap it for you. So wrapping code really doesn't protect keys. So you really need to look at another solution versus hard coding your keys. Keys must be protected, they must be rotated, they must be managed appropriately. What's fortunate is most organizations, especially larger organizations, actually have key management infrastructure already designed and implemented, especially for like certificates and things like that. So there's tools like SafeNet, and RSA has a hardware security module. So these are very hardened appliances out on your network, so I can actually store my keys out there, and then they set up a special rule, so if someone wants to access a key, it has to be from a certain IP address, from a certain OS user account, etc., to get that key. It becomes very effective. If you do want a key management server, Oracle also has the Oracle Key Management solution. If you want to do a free key management server, HashiCorp has an open source key vault that's available. So if you do want to start implementing at least a lower end open source solution, that works effectively. But we always first say, look, talk to your security team and ask, oh, do you have a key management solution that we can utilize? And almost all the major commercial key management solutions have either Java APIs or PL SQL APIs that you can easily call from your database code to actually do this. So that's encrypting data in the database, and so then the second part of the encryption discussion is always around network encryption. How do I do network encryption? And almost always we'll get a response back from the DBAs, oh, yeah, we don't do network encryption because it costs too much money from Oracle. Well, a couple of years ago, Oracle actually changed the licensing for the SQL Net Encryption. It used to be part of the Advanced Security option. Now SQL Net Encryption is included with the Enterprise Edition. This was a change. It was not well documented or advertised by Oracle that they changed this. So if you do need to do SQL Net encryption today, and this is the encryption between the SQL Net client and then maybe an application server or a client connecting to the database server through SQL Net, this is the encryption of that code. Because if you do a query, I do select star from Social Security numbers, when the Social Security numbers get returned to me, they will all be in plain text flying across the network. Hopefully someone can't put a sniffer on your network and capture all that, but you do need to be looking at encrypting that data going across the network. So SQL Net encryption supports all the major encryption standards out there, and it's very robust. Not a lot of people implement it, but it is free now with the Enterprise Edition of the database. Fortunately, it's also very easy to turn on. All you have to do is change the SQL Net Aura, and you add in encryption server, and you can either put requested or required discuss exactly what you want to do there in a second, and then put in the encryption algorithm, and you're done. You restart the listener picks up the changes, and now you're hopefully encrypting the data, and I'll show you some of the different options here and why it may be or not encrypted and what the recommendation is. The only caveat is if you are working with older versions of the Oracle database, depending on the version, some of the older algorithms for encryption that are not recommended anymore, that are weak and quote broken, are still fully supported in Oracle and may be on by default. So that's why the recommendation here is when you see the line SQL Net Encryption types server, we do recommend you put AES 128, AES 256 as the two supported ones. And depending on AES 128 is sufficient enough that it's not broken, that will give you a very good security. If you are a highly secure organization, you would be implementing AES 256. So how does SQL Net Encryption work in terms of how does it actually get turned on and what do I want to set it to? This is, again, where the Thrifty DBA says, I don't want to spend a lot of time and effort doing this. I do want my most secure database. So what's the most effective way to do this without having to go around to every single client and change it? Well, the defaults here are accepted both on the client and the server setting. So based on what the client setting is and the server setting is, there's a little bit of a negotiation that goes on, and depending on each setting, then determines if the SQL Net traffic is encrypted or not. And so when we do that encryption, the result then becomes either on or off, or the connection may fail if the server requires it, but the client says no, they'll reject it. So the black box here is the default. So by default, it's always off. What we want to do is then just change each database server. So again, this is a very minimal change in the environment, and I set the database server to requested. Therefore, the default on the client is still accepted. I haven't had to go around every single client and change anything. All I did was change the SQL Net Aura file on each database server. I said it's requested. Therefore, my encryption's on. That's all you have to do. It becomes very effective. There are other options here. So there is a little bit of a performance overhead with SQL Net Encryption. And so if I do have certain servers that I don't want to encrypt, let's say my application servers for a large data warehouse or something like that that's generating massive amounts of data, and I may not need to encrypt that because it's locally within the data center, or maybe even on the same switch within the data center, so very low probability that that information would be intercepted or compromised. I can actually then go to each application server and just set the SQL Net server setting to rejected. Therefore, if I set it as requested on the database server but rejected on a few individual application servers or processing servers or interface servers or something like that, then it'll be off by default for that connection between those two machines. The reason I probably want to do requested versus required, and again, this depends on the organization, if I do required and the client does get, for some reason, set to rejected, my connection will fail. So I do need to be careful. So that's why we do recommend requested in this situation. But again, this is a very cost-effective. It's included with the Enterprise Edition, and I just have to go around and change it on each database server. And I probably just have to wait for it to be rebooted at some point, and therefore I don't even have to have a downtime. I can just set it, forget it, and then when the server gets rebooted at some point, this will actually start working and be turned on. Other question we always get is how do I actually check that SQL Net Encryption is enabled? You can actually look at the $V session connect info, and it'll actually tell you, if you see the bolded there on the second line in the banner, it'll say encryption service, and if that's, you see that, that therefore means the connection is encrypted. So that's encryption at both the database level and the network level. A second part to this discussion is when I'm trying to protect data, sometimes I need to mask it or redact it. So there are certain cases where I just kind of want to display things to the users or not to the users. The really big requirement, and most organizations don't do a very good job at this, is actually scrambling in test and development. So we use the term scramble. So when you take production and you copy it down to test and development for the developers to see, you need to really be thinking about scrambling the data. So Social Security numbers should not be readable anymore, and also credit card numbers. Oracle uses the word data masking in a couple different ways. They also use data masking to be synonymous with scrambling, but we like to use the word scramble because that's basically what you're doing. Then there's also usually a requirement to potentially mask in production. So if a user is querying the database, they want that data masked. We talked about virtual private database earlier, and I could null out that column. You may also have a requirement to like for social security numbers, display the last 4. What's a cost-effective way to do that without buying third-party tools? And the third-party tools here would be the Oracle Data Redaction, which has replaced SQL Net Encryption, the advanced security option. So I can use Oracle Data Redaction, which is very powerful, very effective for non-ad hoc user connections. So data redaction works really well if I've got a large web application and I need to redact the data displayed to end users. Data redaction works awesome. Unfortunately, it does not work very well if I allow someone to actually connect to the database and enter ad hoc SQL statements. There's a number of ways I can work around data redaction and it bypass the data redaction. And by trying to guess what the values are, that becomes very effective that way. Oracle also has the data masking pack. The data masking pack is fundamentally the scrambling technology. So that the idea there is I'm taking production database, copying down to test development, and it has a bunch of rules and very good processes to actually take the social security numbers and change them to non-readable information. So what's other ways to do this? Typically for data masking and scrambling, we actually most often write SQL scripts. So that's as good as many of the commercial solutions. It's not as good because you don't have the rules. It's if you add in a column, somebody has to open up the script and change it. It doesn't work very well if I have to keep it. Let's say I'm changing social security numbers and it's in 35 different tables, and I have to make sure I change the social security number to the same value in all 35 tables. The Oracle Data Masking Pack works really well on that. But if I just need to take some few values and mask or scramble them really quickly, we still think SQL scripts work so much better than doing the data masking pack. But if I have a large amount of data, I have to keep the data integrity going, data masking pack works really well. There's also a couple free open source solutions. The one we've seen before with people have had success is the Solix Enterprise Data Management Suite. They do have a free version that's available. For redaction, typically what we do for redaction, data redaction, again, works really well with a web application, but it can be bypassed in certain circumstances if I have ad hoc users. Views work just as well as anything else for a custom application because you can then make the view, and you can also call functions out of the views or other ways to do that in code within the view to actually just mask the information, display the last 4. And again, virtual private database works very well because it can return the null columns. It can't actually return the last 4, but if I don't need to see the data, if I don't need to see the last 4, VPD works very well as a solution there. So again, these are just looking at some other options that, yes, I can go buy very expensive tools, but what are the other options? Well, we run into a lot of clients who say, oh no, we have to go buy that tool, but unfortunately we don't have the budget, so we're not going to do anything. Our answer to that is, well, we think you should be doing something, and here's some other alternatives. So we've kind of, in this presentation, walked through what are those other alternatives that they may not be as good as the commercial solutions, but again, it's a lot lower price point, something, and often you can implement a lot quicker too. There's another item within the Oracle Database Enterprise Edition. It's called Transparent Sensitive Data Protection. This is a new feature in 12.1 that actually acts as an inventory for virtual private database and redaction. There's no reason you can't use it on your own. This is really meant for a lot of the Oracle tools to use, so you end up developing a sensitive data inventory and you actually store it in the database, which makes a lot of sense. And therefore then the Oracle tools tend to use it. Well, there's no reason you can't be querying this because it's included with the Enterprise Edition, and you can actually base off your custom scripts, your fine-grained access control policies off of the TSDP inventory. Again, becomes a very effective solution. You can either write this on your own or actually use what Oracle's provided you that's been thought through pretty well, and they're using it for all their commercial tools. There's no reason you can't use it because it is included with the Enterprise Edition. And so it's a set of tables and policies and functions that allow you, or packages to allow you to manage this data. And it's just an inventory of sensitive data. Some of the data searching tools that they have actually cost or additional features. But all they're doing is just populating this data. So you can actually just populate this data on your own too, and then write custom scripts, and then the custom scripts can use this as an inventory. So that was just a high-level overview. I'm just talking about some different options. Instead of having to buy high expensive commercial tools, what are some additional ways that you can do it? And we'll open up to some questions.
Thank you, Steve. We've got several here. The first one is, you mentioned using SYSLOG for auditing. Is there a performance impact?
For SYSLOG for auditing is actually a very good performing solution for database auditing. There are a couple benchmarks out there, and almost always the benchmarks are as good as the native auditing or the OS level auditing. Because remember, with the SYSLOG, I can actually set it up so it's not even writing it to disk, it's just sending it out via the network. So there's actually no disk writes, and traditionally disk writes are your worst performance. So if I can just queue it in memory and it goes out immediately, then that becomes a very effective solution from a performance perspective.
Next question. Does SYSLOG work in 12c?
Yeah, so that is the one change that Oracle is making moving forward. In our discussions with Oracle, there is no immediate intention to disable the SYSLOG or remove it in future versions. So up through 12.2, SYSLOG is still fully enabled. But unified auditing, if you do move to unified auditing, it does not have a SYSLOG capability. So at this point, we still recommend, because it's so beneficial, so easy to do, so capable, to still use mixed mode auditing with even through 12.2 and use SYSLOG. The option is, if you do want to move to 12.2 or 12c sys or unified auditing, the key there would be then you would actually have to go have your logging solution access the tables on a periodic basis and pull the data down, which is a little bit more cumbersome to implement. So our recommendation is use SYSLOG until Oracle gets rid of it, and then that'll be a couple of years from now, and then you can figure out another solution.
Next question. Can we deny session creation to anyone trying to access the database, even if he has the right credentials, but connecting from a suspicious machine?
Typically, you would write a logon trigger to do that, and that's feasible. Database Vault, again, a fairly expensive solution, has a very powerful way to do that. But really the only way is from a Thrifty DBA perspective would be to do a logon trigger and then raise an error, drop the connection, things like that. Unfortunately, there's not a very good solution outside of Database Vault today to do that.
For another question, for audit trail, like auditing unsuccessful logins, what is the performance overhead? Is there any other way to audit it?
Yeah, for auditing unsuccessful logins, I would be shocked if you could ever, unless you purposely tried to brute force it and send massive amounts of unsuccessful logins against the database, that's the only time you'd even ever think about having a performance overhead on unsuccessful logins. We do see occasionally clients that have like rogue processes that are trying to log in 10 times a second. Even that time, we're not seeing any performance overhead from unsuccessful logins. The only time for auditing we ever really run into major performance issues is if you get into transactional level auditing on individual tables. So let's say you have a credit card table and you want every single person who's ever accessing it and starting to audit that data. That is when you can get into a performance overhead issue with auditing. Otherwise, the only thing that we ever recommend auditing that you tend to generate more data is database sessions. But as long as you have well-controlled applications that are using connection pooling, even though that should not be generating that many sessions. So again, when you design your audit trail, you have to be very careful when you look at transactional auditing. So especially like select every time someone touches a credit card table, yes, you can run into problems, but otherwise we see very seldom do we ever see an audit trail issue with performance.
Next question. Can DBAs maintain EBS without apps access? How to protect this?
Yeah, so this is the million-dollar question. So if you are an Oracle E-Business Suite customer, there is a single database account called Apps that has full access to the database, And unfortunately, the DBAs absolutely have to have access to that. That's when they apply patches, when they do maintenance to the database, they have to use apps. And that's why having this audit trail, especially using like SYSLOG, that I can now at least capture where that access is coming from. Unfortunately, for the solutions that we talked about today, there's really two ways you can look at that apps access. I either have a general idea who's using apps, and I know who's got the app's password, so let's say that's 5 DBAs. With these solutions, that works fairly effectively. I can at least know how often it's being used, what machines it's being used from. If I have to get down to a named user to say it was either Bob or Jane in my DBA team who used the apps account at that time, unfortunately what we talked about today does not work. You have to buy a tool like Imperva or Guardium in order to do that.
Last question. Does SQL Net Encryption impact performance?
No, we have not ever seen an issue where it does provide a performance impact. And again, if there is a point where you are doing massive amounts of queries to the database, our recommendation is just on those machines, turn off, set the SQL Net Encryption to rejected. Therefore, those specific connections would not be encrypted. And that's an easy way to get around. If you even think there might be a performance issue, you can get around that way.
All right, thank you, Steve. I think that wraps up our session for the day. I appreciate thank you everybody for spending the afternoon with us. And don't forget to join us next month, June 8th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. That session will be on when you can't apply patches to the database. Should be a very interesting webinar. So thanks again, everybody. Have a great rest of the week.